Well, good evening, and thank you for being here. It looks a little bit formal, but it's going to be informal as we go. So we're here today to celebrate the Human Rights Day, which was yesterday. And at the same time, we are here also to focus on a very important, if you want, barometer or proxy of human rights, which is sexual rights, and to question whether sexual pleasure is a part of those sexual rights and the importance of the sexual pleasure as it reflects on the individual, on the society, on diversity, on social justice, and on power dynamics. This is happening at the same time in 4 places. It's happening in India, in Delhi. It's happening in Joburg in South Africa, and it's happening in London. So Lebanon is one of these 4 sites that celebrates the issue of Human Rights Day. And this is also made possible for the R&B major company that does a lot of scientific research on sexual wellness, sexual health. They're also the makers of Durex. It's also done in support with the Global Advisory Board on Sexual Health and Sexual Wellness, and also under the umbrella of the Network of the Arab Scholars of Sexuality and Sexual Health, which is NAS, housed at the Faculty of Health Science at the American University of Beirut. I want to thank again all of you who are here and who are still coming. I want to thank Jad Mar'i for his technical support and media support. And I want to thank the panelists for being here from Mosaic, from the A Project, as you will see later, from LabMash, and my colleague Sandrine also, and for their not only being here, but also for their, again, social media support. I just want to introduce the panel in 5 or less than 5 minutes. I'll be moderating this panel in my capacity as coordinator of NAS and also as a faculty at Faculty of Health Science at AB, and also as a physician at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Our speakers are Shad Ibrahim, psychiatrist from LabMash, Pascal Koulakis, psychologist and co-founder of Mosaic, Sandrine Atallah, she is a sexual medicine and psychosexologist. She is on the International Sexual Medicine Society. Rola Yasmin, she's been like away. She used to work with me for 3 years, and she's like 1 year I have not seen her, even more.
I'm here now.
Rola, she is a reproductive and sexual health researcher, and she is doing a great job with the A Project, again on issues of sexual health. Well, probably some of us might remember, and others would like to have a quick refresher, that we who are interested in sexual health and sexual medicine and sexual well-being of the people have been, we currently and those before us have been fighting with this since 1975. In fact, we're not inventing anything, we're just pushing things forward. From 1975 to 2017, that's around like probably 42 years, sexual health started in 1975 as acknowledgement and being part of health of people, and that was really a major breakthrough to start talking about sexual health. Then came the definition of sexuality by WHO in the year 2000, 2002. I had the pleasure and the honor of being part of that global group to question the move from sexual health as it donates or implies sometimes sexual infections, implies negative connotations, implies naming, shaming, sin, and dirt, into the sexuality to make it more human and to make it more central to our human being. And that's where the issue of erotic feelings, the issue of pleasure, and all these related sexual rights, sexual diversity, and other were captured in the definition of sexuality. And that was the period of 2000 to 2006 and 7. That was this debate. And if you Google the definition of sexuality in WHO, it's still called a working definition, because these things are evolving, especially in terms of understanding the issue of sexual rights. And then came the discourse of the Global Advisory Board and other groups to talk about the importance of sexual pleasure, as I said, as a proxy for sexual justice and well-being. And the definition, just to be an entry point for our discussion, is that sexual pleasure is a physical and or psychological satisfaction and enjoyment derived from solitary or shared erotic experiences, including thoughts, dreams, and autoeroticism. And you can see the wider span now for people to enjoy their sexual being. Enabling factors for pleasure to contribute to sexual health and well-being is self-determination, consent, safety, privacy, confidence, and ability to communicate and negotiate sexual relations. And this is, I think you agree with me, is at the heart of the human rights code. Then came, if you want, the development of this understanding is that within the context of human rights, okay, sexual pleasure is to be enjoyed, perceived, and expressed in rights to equality and non-discrimination, in autonomy and bodily integrity, okay, and that includes, of course, absence of coercion, the issue of violence, female genital mutilation, use of harmful objects or practices, right to highest attainable standard of health, combined with the bioethical approach also of duty and responsibility in that matter. And the fourth dimension is freedom of expression, of expressing your sexuality, your preferences, and the like. And so the experiences of human sexual pleasure are diverse, and sexual rights to ensure that pleasure is a positive experience for all, okay? Especially those concerned and not obtained by violating other people's human rights and well-being. And that's the Global Advisory Board definition for 2016. And you can see with this definition and this understanding the intersection between sexual health, not only intersection, it's the interweaving of sexual health, sexual pleasure, and sexual rights. And this is for you to simply compare the content of sexual pleasure and the content of sexual rights, and you will see that they're very similar. And we're talking about the same thing, whether in relation to freedom, choice, consent, pleasure, integrity, confidence, negotiating sexual relations, equality, autonomy. So that's why it should be a fundamental part of sexual rights. Okay? The sexual right definition was adopted by the WAS, which is the World Association of Sexual Health, and it's still a good, solid definition adopted by mostly all the international groups. Okay? And the pleasure of this. So with this entering statement, I want to welcome again all of you to this panel, and we will start with Dr. Shahid Ibrahim. As I said, Dr. Shahid Ibrahim is a psychiatrist, and he is with the LEBMASH, which is the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health. Shadi.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khan.
Definitely we'll try to leave a lot of time for your comments, interventions, but if there is any burning intervention or question, you can just go ahead and ask us, okay? It's not like, after all, we're talking about sexual pleasure, so you have to be enjoying the discussion we're having. not like, yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Shadi Ibrahim. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also a sexologist, and I'm a partner of the Lebanese Medical Association for Sexual Health. I'm going to develop what Dr. Kak just said and include all sexual diversity groups when we talk about sexual rights. But before we talk about this, it's pretty simple to me. Sexuality and sexual health is where physical health and mental health get together. So if I have a problem in my physical health, or if I have a problem in my mental health, my sexual health will be automatically affected. And the interest of science in sexuality is very recent. It only began in the 20th century. So it's still a new science to us, and we're still trying to understand it. So that's why I'm going to detail what happened in the World Congress of Sexology in 1999, where the World Association for Sexology adopted the Universal Declaration of Sexual Rights. Now, when we talk about sexual health, it's not just a science that we need to study and understand the physiology of sexuality. We also need to understand the importance of sexuality in people's lives, which explains the big crowd today as well. It's a very important topic. So within the 11 sexual rights that were mentioned, there is a clear one that says we have the right to sexual pleasure. We have the right to feel pleasure. We have the right to have our sexual privacy, to choose our partners, to be equal, to emotionally express our sexuality freely, okay, and to make free and responsible reproductive choices. So these enter the reproductive part of sexuality. So when we talk about this, it's important to include the LGBT population. And by LGBT, I mean the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual population. So everything that applies to human beings applies to all human beings, whether they're heterosexual, homosexual, or whatever sexual orientation or gender identity they belong to. So when we begin with this principle, the principle of equality and the principle of sexual rights as a human right, this also includes the LGBT population. And I'm gonna end my little intervention by talking about the Yogyakarta principles that if I want to explain them, this was just published a few weeks ago actually, so that's why I'm mentioning it. It applies the human rights to the LGBT population. And these are very important principles because I just want to stress on this main message. Human rights and sexual rights apply to everyone, including the LGBT community. So this is the main message of my intervention today. Later on, during the interactive session, I'm going to share a part of my experience with the couples and the LGBT population in Lebanon when it comes to pleasure and the notion of pleasure and the importance of pleasure, and when pleasure is problematic in the couple and in the intimate relationship. So we're going to talk about this later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadi, very much for this. We're waiting for the interactive sessions. Our next panelist, Pascal Koulakis. Pascal is a co-founder of Mosaic, and Pascal is a psychologist, and she will be addressing sexual pleasure and sexual diversity.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about sexual pleasure and sexual diversity. Now, this is a very large subject, and I thought about tackling the subject from my clinical experience, whether in MERSA or in Mosaic, because I am a psychotherapist with MERSA. So when we first think about sexual diversity, automatically we think about LGBT, about lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender persons. But this is not all about, this is not what sexual diversity is all about. So we grow up we learn from our parents, we hear from the people around us that sexuality is about a heterosexual man, a heterosexual woman coming together. Usually the sexual response is focused on genitalia, and the goal is to get to orgasm. Now, any one of us, can at some point in their life not be in this model. So it could be either on a fantasy level, it could be on an emotional level, on thoughts, on feelings, on sexual practices. So each one of us at some point might think that they are sexually diverse. So sex can be ecstatic, it could be routine, it could be transgressive. And whenever we are not really complying to the model we have since we were children, here starts to come guilt, shame, we're surprised, we're confused. What's happening? Why aren't we like everyone else, like they tell us that we need to be? So usually, these are the people that I see in the clinic. It all starts with a simple sexual practice or a sexual motivation or even a sexual behavior, but then the reaction that is based on social construct, that is based on religion, that is based on culture, on the family, will make this person question their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Now, usually what we see in the clinic is a very large variety of sexual practices. So, for example, of course, people who have sexual feelings, sexual attraction to the same sex or gender, but also people who have feelings for both men and women. Feelings one's biological sex does not match their gender identity. Being happy with one's biological sex, but wanting to express ourselves socially in the opposite gender. Not being able to desire the person we love. Not even having any sexual desire. Being a homosexual man, but wanting to have sex with women. Being a lesbian, but enjoying vaginal penetration. So all of these, we can continue on and on and on. All these do get in what we call sexual diversity. Now, I'm going to give you some clinical examples about how do people who are suffering from all this stigma, from all these, let's say, stereotypes, do live this suffering in the clinic. I usually see a lot of young men, usually aged between 19 and 25, who would come and who would state their demand as, I don't want to be homosexual anymore. So this is their demand. So the reason is, of course, social pressure, family pressure. But the main question that they ask, am I normal? Why am I different? If religion is right, then why did God create me like this? What have I done wrong? So what's happening? So a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of confusion. So you can only imagine how will that impact their sexual activities and their sexual pleasure. So usually these young men will repress themselves into getting into any sexual activity because for them even to fantasize about something that is not heteronormative, it can be something very wrong. So they either go into, let's say, solitary sexual pleasure, where the guilt and the shame are less because no one is seeing; it's only between themselves. Or if they were with a partner, usually what happens is either they have erectile dysfunction, they got a lot of pain, they cannot even handle being with someone, or they even accept being humiliated, being dominated, just for the sake of thinking that they are getting into any sexual pleasure. So sexual pleasure for them is not even enjoying the sexual act. It's about being with a partner. It's about being with someone. But because the model that we have is only about performance, is about getting to the orgasm, all this connectedness, all this emotion, emotion. All right. So this is not enough. Okay. So this is why they might go into behavior that would harm them, then would make them feel some sort of pleasure. But not only homosexual young men are struggling with sexual pleasure. I receive also many heterosexual men I'm going to give an example about a heterosexual man in his mid-30s. So he's married, he has 2 children. All right, so when he was a child, he used to enjoy getting dressed with his mother's clothes, putting on some makeup, putting her shoes, which can be a part of the child development. And then he grew out of it. This is his words, not my interpretation. So he says that he grew out of it up until he went to college. This is when he had his real sexual experiences, and he found out that he really enjoys having, let's say, some sort of piece of women's clothing on him, maybe putting on some makeup, and imagining that he is in the attire of women. He met his wife on campus, and he was very honest with her since the beginning, and she had no problem with having this sexual fantasy. But you need to know that their sexual behavior was always him being the active man and she being the receiving woman. So also it's in the stereotype of sexual intercourse. So the man is the giving and the woman is receiving. So during their marriage, they had 2 children. He started to discover that he would be very excited whenever his wife will, strike his nipples or his anus. So little by little, he started to fantasize that he wanted to be a woman who would be receiving, all right, sexual attention from his wife as a woman. So being honest with his wife, he went and told her, well, this is my sexual fantasy. Now, she freaked out because this is not the position of a man and a woman in a couple. Now, she would accept, she would even tolerate him wearing, let's say, some sort of women's lingerie, putting on some makeup, but the fact that he was requesting of him being dominated by her during the sexual encounter, she could not handle this. So she even led him into questioning his gender identity. And this is how he came to the clinic, because it was so hard to him. So what's happening? Am I really, do I have a disorder? Am I sick? Because these were the words that he heard. These were the impression that he got from his wife. All right? So why did I talk about these 2 cases? Examples, actually. It's just to say that any sexual behavior that is not accepted by a partner, that is not understood by a partner, can be considered as sexually diverse. And if it's not accepted, if we cannot really get to the pleasure, all right, in the way we fantasize, we sense, we think, we have the emotions, this will cause us a lot of hurt, a lot of suffering, which will impact, of course, our mental health, our physical health. And from here, the importance of psychotherapists, people who work in mental health, to create spaces that are safe enough for people to be able to talk about their fantasies, imagining their sexuality, reimagining their sexuality without any shame or any guilt. So, of course, if you have any questions, we can talk about this later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and this again reflects, as I think I'm sure will come up in the discussions, the importance of the sexual pleasure to body integrity and to communication between the couples. And that's what we mentioned in the definition of the GAP 2016. The sexual pleasure is about the freedom of expression. And that's why sometimes also that sexual pleasure in the absence of freedom might be perceived differently in different situations and also might lead to the sometimes wrong perception. Another, what I want to call it like another assassin of sexual pleasure is probably violence and certain sexual practices, certain sexual ill-beings, and sometimes the difficulty for the couple in mentioning this or talking about this because of cultural restrictions and issues with the upbringing and so on and so forth. And I'll be happy now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sandrine Atallah. She's a sexual medicine psychosociologist who will again share some of her experiences in relation to sexual pleasure in a couple's life?
Thank you. I hope I will not be out of the subject, because pleasure is a very, very big topic, and maybe it should be among sexual rights, maybe not. It depends on how we perceive pleasure. The big question I have today is, are we as sexologists, are we pleasureologists? Do we talk about pleasure? Are we talking about pleasure with our patients, or do we actually talk about function and dysfunction? Do doctors ask, do you feel pleasure when you have an orgasm? Are you enjoying the sexual act? Are you sexually satisfied with your partner or partners? It's a difficult question to answer, and even Dr. House doesn't have an answer. Well, to understand and to have an answer, we should ask ourselves, what is sexual pleasure? Do all conjugal sexual activity include pleasure? Is pleasure always sexual between couples? And a lot of couples will tell you no. Sometimes we have sex, but we don't have sexual pleasure. And sometimes we have sexual pleasure, but we don't have sex. So why do couples have sex? Is it to reproduce, or to experience sexual pleasure, or to relieve a sexual tension, or to relate more intimately? Maybe it can be to reproduce, but it's only one sub-factor. If we look at the study, we see that we have 237 reasons to have sex, with 4 large factors and 13 sub-factors. And pleasure is only one sub-factor among many others. So what is pleasure? The nature of pleasure is not so simple. Is it physical, or is it mental? Is it linked to biology, or is it linked to psychology? Is it really measurable when we're talking about sexual pleasure as a sexual right? What do we mean by sexual pleasure? Do we have like a scale for sexual pleasure, or is it a subjective experience? And of course, are we really talking about it? Well, the nature of pleasure is not so simple. In addition to all the plumbing issues of biology that refer to the responses of organs to hormones, to nervous systems and blood flows, pleasure is based on the activity of the brain, of the mind. I always tell my patients that pleasure is between your ears, not between your legs. It's also related to perceptions, imagination, memory, and they all play a role into producing this ecstatic outcomes referred to by Kinsey. I guess you know Kinsey, and he was the first who studied sexuality and sexual behaviors. And it's even more complicated because for some people, sexual pleasure is individual. They only have sexual pleasure when they masturbate, or when they fantasize, or when they watch porn. And some other will tell you, no, I don't have pleasure if I'm not with a partner. I cannot enjoy it, whether it's one night stand, or a long-term relationship, or a threesome, or an orgy, etc., etc. And for some, they will tell you, I cannot feel pleasure if I'm not in love. If I don't feel love, I cannot feel pleasure. And for others, and we see it a lot in our practice, they cannot feel sexual pleasure if they are in love, because they feel that pleasure is sinful, is dirty, and it will sully the purity of their love. And this is what we call the Madonna-prostitute complex that we see a lot in our practices. And some couples are more open about sexual pleasure, and they believe that sexual pleasure is essential for marital success. And for others, giving sexual pleasure is just a marital duty. Anyway, in our societies, because we want to get married, for almost everyone, marriage is not consummated without sex, with or without pleasure. But for some, pleasure is much more complicated, and it's really an experience that is shared between 2 or 3 or 4 bodies, minds, souls, cultures, and of course, psychological factors. If we go into details and we talk about our couples and the couples we see in the clinic, for some, sexual pleasure is about orgasm. A lot of women come to my clinic and tell me I'm not sexually satisfied because I do not reach an orgasm. Or some men tell me we have a delayed ejaculation, we can not reach an orgasm, and if I don't have an orgasm, I'm not satisfied, I don't feel any sexual pleasure. But however, for some, they can feel an orgasm, but they do not feel the pleasure. For example, premature ejaculation men are so anxious because of the fast ejaculation that they do not perceive any pleasure. Some women can feel an orgasm, they feel the contractions in their vagina, but they do not enjoy it. They do not feel sexual pleasure. And even more, some women fake orgasm to give men sexual pleasure, and they feel sexual pleasure because they faked orgasm to give sexual pleasure to their men. So it can be very, very complicated. And for some women, most pleasurable sexual experiences are those where they feel connected to a partner and they are not related only to orgasm. It is also about fantasies. It is also about sexual preferences. And some people do have fetishism or do have other sexual behaviors like BDSM, for example. And a recent study showed that BDSMers were more sexually satisfied than non-BDSMers. Why? Because they communicate about their needs. And I guess that communication is essential for sexual pleasure. If we want to go further, for some people there is no sexual pleasure in the presence of pain. And some women come to us or some men come to us and tell us we are not satisfied, we do not feel any pleasure because sex is painful. However, for some, there is no sexual pleasure without pain. And here again, we're talking about BDSMers. But sometimes the pursuit of sexual pleasure leads to risky behaviors because some might think that, oh, if I wear a condom, I do not feel any pleasure. And some women will say, I don't like him to wear a condom because I don't feel any pleasure. And some women will say, when I take my pill, I don't have any desire anymore and I don't feel any pleasure anymore. So I stop and I into risky behaviors. And I also see some patients, they tell me if I'm not under drugs, I do not feel any sexual pleasure, etc., etc., etc. And sometimes it leads to gender inequity because if we're saying that sexual pleasure is a right, so I can impose myself on my partner and I tell him it's my right, I want my sexual pleasure, you need to give me my sexual pleasure now. So sexual pleasure is a complicated issue because it's taboo. And in societies that come from a religious background, sometimes sexual pleasure is a sin. Sometimes sexual pleasure is bad. However, in our clinical practice, pleasure is a core component of sexual health. And it requires a respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships. And of course, the possibility of allowing our patients of having pleasurable but of course safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination and violence. However, we said it was a right, we said it's important for well-being, it's taboo, and sometimes it is even taboo for health practitioners. It seems that no one talks about pleasure. We know that sexual pleasure is important, but we do not ask about it because it's taboo, because we're not well trained, because we don't have a lot of time. I only have 2 slides left, don't worry. It's like our patients
I'm
are...
enjoying the.
Okay.
I feel pleasurable.
Oh, wow. This is great. So we feel like our patients are trapped in a conspiracy of silence. Patients are waiting the doctor to talk about pleasure. Doctors are waiting the patient to talk about pleasure. And no one talks about pleasure. So in order to give this right to our patients, we need to communicate, and we need to encourage them to communicate with their partners. Because with no communication, there's no pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think also no wonder why most of the discourses, whether the cultural or religious discourses, have shamed pleasure, because one of the agencies of control of women's sexuality is to control her sexual pleasure and sexual feeling. And that's why some, for example, the practice of FGM, mutilation of the clitoris, is to silence the potential eroticism and the pleasure of women, which is considered as a fitna for all those raging men around, and so you better silence. So all this repression of sexuality have also focused on the pleasure, because the pleasure, as we have been discussing, the dynamics of the relation, if pleasure is demanded, then this is too much to ask also from males who are tuned to satisfy their own sexual desires, irrespective of the desire or the wanting of their partners. Because if you think about it, in that discourse, demanding sexual pleasure by a female is probably a lot to ask in that regard. And under this falls the issue of the foreplay, the time you take to have sex, the orgasmic experiences. That's one of the most frustrating complaints that will face all of us and many others in the clinic, and so on and so forth, because sexual pleasure by itself is a proxy of so many potential, of so many capabilities that women should have. Well, with this little note, I will leave it to the last panelist, Ms. Rola Yasmin, to talk about how sexual pleasure is affected by practices of violence and unhealthy relations.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to complicate pleasure a little bit more, in the sense that we've talked about it in
already
terms
complicated.
It's going to get complicated. Okay, so in the sense that sexual pleasure, we've discussed it between couples, thruples, and groups, and we've discussed it in terms of queer relationships and LGBTs, and I guess in a clinical spectrum. I want to kind of discuss sexual pleasure from a violence perspective, but I guess I want to talk more about a systemic violence, and a systemic violence and oppression on specifically women, gender non-conforming, trans bodies, people with disabilities, people living with HIV, migrants, refugees. So when we're talking about sexual pleasure, when we say everybody has the right to sexual pleasure, we really mean everybody, right? So that means we're also discussing people who are not usually at the table or at the forefront, and maybe sometimes, and this is wrongfully so, but sexual pleasure is seen as a luxury to some sort, when it really is not. It is the most basic form of entertainment, I guess, that one can have in and
basic and advanced,
and it's free, and sometimes you pay for it, and that's okay. But anyway, so I kind of wanted to discuss that a little bit. So if we're saying that pleasure is a negotiation between 2 or 3 or 4 people, then we're saying that people are not equal, right? Then we can bet that sexual pleasure and the negotiation of sexual pleasure between people who are facing different kinds of oppressions, who have different kinds of privileges, will also not be equal. And when something is really sweet and really nice, like a treat, and you have the power power to take more than you give back, then, and without the consent of that, of course, obviously some of us are givers more than takers, and that's something else. Anyway, so in that regard, then we can also talk about that there are systemic and there are powers at play that are affecting on a very individual level whether or not we can attain pleasure, right? And so I want to discuss these obstacles a little bit. So we talked a little bit about cultural, and Sandrine mentioned a little bit about cultural issues. So I want to kind of discuss, so there is obviously within the system of patriarchal violence, we can definitely be sure that heteronormative expectations, and what you were talking about in terms of this man, woman, child, and this reproductive narrative, it doesn't necessarily need to counter pleasure, but it has been a stopper of pleasure for some time. So how is it that patriarchy affects our attainment of pleasure? So if you want to think about, we can think about the big killers, the big assailants, the big assassinators, for example, to talk about rape, but specifically which ones fall under the radar. If we think about marital rape, for example, then we know that people who are in a state-sanctioned, religiously sanctioned marriage may face rape that is not rape as a fantasy rape that people are playing out, like rape that is violent, unwanted, unconsensual, dutiful sex. In that regard, it's very hard to be enjoying sex or to be receiving sexual pleasure if this is something that you did not want. I know it sounds a little bit on the basic, but if we think about also, and for us at least at the A Project, we don't see sexual pleasure to be possible without reproductive justice. So there's no reproductive component of sexuality. We find them that they're all kind of intersecting. So how is reproductive justice in the conversation around patriarchy incredibly important to whether or not we get sexual pleasure? One of them would be in this regard, the statement, this expectation that women need to just take whatever it is that comes to them in terms of pregnancies. This kind of labor, this reproductive labor that's being placed, this burden of labor that's being placed on women is quite the killer. I'm assuming that both in clinical practices, one would notice that obviously the more domestic work you have, the more reproductive labor you have to take, the more that really does affect your being able to entertain and to be able to give back and forth and receiving and giving back pleasure. This is quite and basic, right? So the right to access contraception, right? The right to be able to say how many children you want, if you want children at all, how much the spacing between children would be. This is quite an important right. And how does it affect pleasure? I think it's pretty obvious to see that, after a long day of taking care of 3-4 kids and having to do all the domestic work, you're not in the mood to fuck, to be honest. Can I say fuck?
You said it.
I usually say, can I
twice.
say fuck? No, I didn't say fuck the first time.
This is the third time.
So...
This is a free panel. You can see whatever you want.
Fantastic. So...
But you cannot do whatever you want.
Okay. Within consent. Anyways, so basically the conversation is that, so the right to all of these things, since we're talking about the right to pleasure, it goes hand in hand with the other rights that we are discussing, and it goes definitely hand in hand with the conversation around whether or not you, being a compulsory motherhood, being forced to be a mother outside of your want, or being more mothering to more children than you wanted, also is a very tiring experience. And looking at the cultural expectations that women are supposed to kind of pan out within a domestic setup, whether it's marriage or out of marriage, there is this push from media and all of this to be able to constantly be the one that spices things up or kind of keeps things going, which would be nice if one had the time or the liberty or the luxury to do so. So this is one of the issues. But if we move away from this and we think about other people also. So let's think about institutional racism and classism, and specifically against refugee bodies, right? So in terms of, let's think about right now, because everybody wants to talk about it, the fact that there's a big number of Syrians living in Lebanon, and a lot of the conversation always falls around Why do they keep having so many children? Why do they keep having so many children, right? And the same conversation happened back in the war with Israel, right? Why are so many displaced citizens from the south having so many children? Why are people having so much sex in a time of crisis? Well, people have sex in crisis. It's the only thing you can do, really. And when you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, you want intimacy and you want sex, or maybe you don't, but it is something that you can do, right? So at the same time, so institutional racism, how does that affect pleasure? Every time you have to go to a doctor or gynecologist or whatever, or UNHCR's doctors and gynecologists or MSFs, you have to say, hey, I'm pregnant. Again, and then what do you get? First of all, why did you get pregnant? Why did you get pregnant? How is this supposed to at all encourage an atmosphere of the right to pleasure if we are all supposed to attain the right to pleasure? When we know for a fact that there are obstacles to accessing reproductive health services, real problems, real financial problems, where even middle-class Lebanese girls have a problem accessing proper education and information and access to reproductive health matters and tools, to control their fertility so that they can enjoy sexual activity without bearing any consequence to their body, to being forced to being a mother outside of your time or outside of your will. So at this point, then we would think, okay, there is an institutional racism that is going on that eventually does affect pleasure, because then you're terrified of getting pregnant. Why? Because you're as a refugee woman in this country, you are going to be sneered at and you're going to be looked at, and there's going to be a lot of I can't believe they're having more children, جيبوا الأولاد وبتكبوهم kind of thing, and where obviously the right to accessing a safe abortion is not also available, then you are basically being cornered into compulsory motherhood. So how does all of these affect, obviously, access to pleasure? We can also think about, not so long ago, right, the General Security issued a notice that domestic workers are not allowed to have sexual relationships while they're working, because when they, get off the flight and they're in Beirut now, they're on the job. They're not supposed to be a human being that has more than a desire to just work. So how is it then that state violence, and this is another form of oppression on our bodies, right, really kind of coerces us into what we can or cannot do? And so we think about how are the expectations not only of state, because the General Security doesn't act of their own accord always, but it's also a very cultural thing that mostly people say, no, if there's a woman who's going to work in my house, I don't want her having sexual relationships outside. And this is really problematic. If we're going to all sit here and say that we really care about sexual pleasure and the right to sexual pleasure and the attainment of this, all of us, then aren't we all supposed to be able to have that access and at the same time have the information, have the access to the services, reproductive health services, that would also help us kind of attain that right and the other, not only for sexual pleasure, but also for our safety and our health and for us to be leading the lives that we want. If we think about the legal ramifications, so part of state violence, if we think about the criminalization of trans bodies, right, the criminalization of queer bodies, and how about in interpersonal relationships amongst queers, right, if there is sexual violence, if there is violence of any sort, something you cannot report as well, how does that affect your sexual pleasure? How does it affect it if you cannot have a conversation around your sexual orientation? Then how can you have a conversation? How can you have a conversation around sexual violence when this is something that's completely erased, where women who are queer, where men who are queer and trans bodies are not even supposed to be around and having relationships, so much that they cannot even report violence, and then they can't even discuss the pleasure that comes from the absence of that violence. So they all kind of are all interconnected with each other. Do I have a limitation? Okay. So then I want to say that I think one of the saddest constraints of sexual pleasure is the one that happens from also medical patriarchy, where you have a lot of physicians, like you were saying, Sandrine, not discussing sexuality, not discussing sexual pleasure. A long time ago, and Joel can attest to this, I worked at a hospital very close by, and basically sexual pain was people like to respond to pain. Everything else was not really that necessary, right? And pain because maybe there's a really smart biological imperative under all that pain, and that then maybe it might lead to something more interesting than just the fact that somebody's complaining of not being able to attain sexual pleasure because of pain. But medical patriarchy basically sees everything else as primary and sexual pleasure and satisfaction as secondary. So if we think about, for example, people living with HIV, and this is, I'm going to take a moment to drop the fact that we're having a really cool talk next week, Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, if you guys want to come, on HIV. Really cool talk. And it's going to be on HIV, but we're going to be discussing PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. And so how PrEP has reshaped and revolutionized sex for people who do not want to be HIV positive, but want to have relationships with people who are living with HIV. And even without PrEP.
Can you just say what's PrEP?
Yeah, pre-exposure prophylaxis. That's the prophylaxis before you get exposed to HIV. So it's kind of like the post-exposure. Yeah. No, I was actually explaining it. Anyway, so the thing about, so there's PrEP, and PrEP is not available because, well, for many reasons. But to say that, for example, people living with HIV are, if we say that they do not have the right to attain the highest form of scientific advancements and medical advancements, and not only them, obviously, all people, then wouldn't we also be worried that basically we're saying that people who are living with HIV are not allowed to experience sexual pleasure, are not allowed intimacy, by saying that these are medications that are not going to be available, and these are medications, not only this one, but also antiretroviral therapy, which is the therapy for people living with HIV. Okay. Yes. Well, it's going to happen. Okay. So, So what I want to say, though, is that that the conversation around undetectable is untransmittable, which is a worldwide known fact, is not really a discussion that happens in Beirut and in Lebanon. And most of the time, there is a lot of shaming for people who are living with HIV, and a lot of, I want somebody who's clean. These are on the dating apps that happen. So, to think about basically also people who are living with disabilities, who are never at the table, right? Who are never people who are discussing their right to sexual pleasure. I mean, their citizenship is already kind of stripped from them, in the sense that it's hard to vote when, the voting stations are 3 floors up and you're in a wheelchair and there's no elevator. But besides this, besides not being given your full citizenship rights, there's also this assumption that people with disabilities do not thirst for love or intimacy or sex even. And so I'm reminded of a really nice protest that happened in Paris when there was a crackdown on sex workers. And sex workers and disability rights activists chained themselves to a building because they see that they have not a conflict of interest, but the very opposite. And I'm not sure what that word is. But, that's... And 1 minute, okay. And so sex workers being targeted by the police for soliciting on the street really it placed them into hiding, and they could not give their services. And a lot of people who were purchasing sexual services were people with disabilities. So we obviously have a much larger problem that is a lot more structural in the way that we can or cannot access sexual health and sexual rights, and that comes from a lot of systemic issues in terms of, like I said, classism, racism, patriarchy, sexism, and transphobia. And so here also, and I'll end on this one completely, is that we don't see sexual rights or sexual pleasure without reproductive justice. And so any country that forces a trans body to go through not gender-affirming surgeries to become valid in the face of the law, to do surgeries against your will that are sterilizing surgeries, is, I think, one of the worst and most violent crimes against trans bodies. Why should our bodies be constricted to somebody else's tick boxes of what a man and a woman really should be? I guess I'll end it at that. Maybe that was a bit vague, but if somebody asks me about it, I can follow up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Before I open the floor for your comments and questions, I want to remind you, by the end of this interesting, beautiful panel, We'll have a refreshment and something to nibble upon. Just here. And also, guess what? We have a big box of condoms by Durex to take with you. So, does it mean if you have a condom, you don't have a food or a drink? You can have both. Okay? And it's so, after listening to all these interesting comments, it's sad to see how such a basic need like sexual well-being and sexual pleasure is so much affected negatively by lots of things that we carry on from culture, religion, society, medicine, and all the other things in our lives. I will open the floor for discussion, for comments, questions. I will appreciate if they are like brief, focused, whether there are questions or comments. We have good 30, 40 minutes, whatever, how much you want to stay. Nisreen. Dr. Nisreen Rizq.
Thanks. So, good evening. Thank you for this panel and the discussion and the presentations. I'm an HIV physician. I work in Beirut, and I wanted to clarify here the two concepts that were mentioned by Rula, PEP and PrEP. So first of all, in Beirut and Los Angeles, New York, everywhere in the world, undetectable is untransmittable about HIV. So somebody who's HIV positive, on medications, whoever they are, can have sex without using condoms and not worry about transmitting HIV to their partners. This is clear. This is how I talk to my patients in the clinic. This is how we talk to everyone today. This was proven by science, multiple studies in all groups of sexually active individuals. We know this. Undetectable equals untransmittable when it comes to HIV. So I would like this to be clear for everybody. This is great. People still need to remember about STIs, sexually transmitted infections. Why are you shaking your why are you nodding? Do you approve or not? Okay, no. But do you have a question? Is there no? But so STIs, sexually transmitted infections, remain a major issue. So dropping the condoms may not be appropriate for everybody who has HIV, unless they are sure about the STI status of their partners. Okay. Just to be clear, the sexual pleasure, okay. That part. Now, PrEP means pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is again proven by science and multiple studies that for HIV negative individuals, taking some of the HIV medications all the time or interrupted, but with medical supervision, that's very important, can prevent the acquisition of HIV. So today, for a sexually active person who might perceive themselves at risk for HIV, might use medications, again, under medical supervision and prevent HIV transmission, and that's what we mean by PrEP. Those are kind of undetectable is transmittable is very new. Yani this year, 2017, is really new, adopted by the WHO.
WHO adopts a bit late sometimes.
This is the first time it's clear for every group, all people, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. So undetectable is untransmittable. This is kind of recent, within the last 12 months. The PrEP and the deployment of PrEP definitely, obviously, it started in America. It's FDA approved, covered by insurance. All medical expenses and care that have to do with PrEP are covered by insurance. This is not the case in Beirut, unfortunately, like a lot of other sexually transmitted infection screening, testing, and even treatment is not covered by any insurance in Beirut. That's an important point to discuss, I think, and to bring up here. This relates to sexual rights. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind and address that maybe at the policy level or at other level.
Thank you very much. I thought you're going to have hundreds of questions. Let's see. Yes, Dr. Alaywan and then Mr. Saadi.
Good evening. My name is Nadine Alaywan. I'm a gynecologist. Thank you for this panel because this discussion is very interesting to me.
Thank
we
you,
are
Nadine.
touching upon the subject more and more in our clinics, actually. And my question is for Ms. Koulakis. You mentioned about men, heterosexual or homosexual, reaching to your clinic. So is it more about men reaching for their sexual pleasure more than women? Do you see this more?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, yes, people who are questioning their sexual orientation, gender identity, are mostly men who come to the clinic. So usually we do not see women questioning. We see women coming for other reasons. Either they have a different sexual orientation or gender identity, but the questioning starts with men. And I think I have an explanation to this. We were talking about social construct. Rula talked about patriarchy, about the ideas that we have about men. So if a man is not really following whatever the culture tells him, whatever the society tells him about his masculinity, therefore it's a lot to take in, and they start questioning their gender identity and their sexual orientation. And actually they come because they are suffering, because they have been humiliated or stigmatized, discriminated by their wife, the family, the peers, etc. So
I think, thank you very much. If you allow me just to follow on your... Can you elaborate a little bit on the contested masculinities in this part of the world in relation to questioning sexual identity? Because I agree with you, it's much more of a question to males than to females. So from your own perspective, do you see it's more, not like complex, it's much more contested in terms of masculinities in relation to
sexuality?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of theories who would talk about the man being active, the man being dominating, the man penetrating the woman as a sign of masculinity. Now, I do not remember all the names of the theorists, but if we go through the literature, we can find a lot, especially focusing on this part of masculinity. So we were talking about sexual diversity. And if a man has a fantasy or a feeling or an emotion at some point that does not really align with this image of manhood, of masculinity, of being, the dakar in our culture, so this will it's going to shake him. It's going to really make him question, am I really a man? And this starts between a simple questioning between him and himself. He doesn't even dare to talk about it. It's only in safe places, in places where he knows that he's not going to be judged, stigmatized, discriminated against, not being even humiliated in his masculinity, that he dares to even think about it and to talk about it. Usually they repress it.
But I have to comment on it. Even women have problems with their with the stereotypes that we have here in Lebanon, because a woman should be nicely dressed, maybe a lot of makeup, with her hair brushed, and maybe her nose done and her breasts done. So I've seen patients, lesbian and non-lesbians, questioning their sexual identity, questioning the fact that I don't like to wear a skirt, I don't feel powerful when I wear a skirt, when I wear heels, I prefer to be without heels. And some women also question their bisexuality, and they feel threatened by this bisexuality because they are lost or confused. Do I prefer women or do I prefer men? Why am I sleeping with both? What is happening? I'm misjudged by my heterosexual friends, and I'm misjudged by my lesbian friends. I don't know what to do. And here is the question of what is my vagina? What should I do with my vagina if I'm homosexual? Should I use it or not? Can it give me pleasure or not? So we see a lot of questioning. But talking about pleasure when it comes to women is more difficult because it's more taboo. So even me as a sexologist, and I see men and women, heterosexual and non-heterosexual. Men come and talk about pleasure or talk about sexual function more because if they're not functional, they cannot have sex. Women, if they're not functional, they still can have sex. So it's difficult to talk about this taboo and intimate issue if their couple is not threatened, it's not a priority for them, not to mention that it is a luxury and it's costly. They might not come and talk about it.
That's why probably you get most the cases of women with vaginismus because they won't be functional.
Exactly.
Yes, but part of it. The part of it. Mr. Saadi, and then wait.
So my question is, what Dr. Ibrahim said, that this science as public health and public sexuality is new and it's only been studied from the 20th century. So talking here as in Lebanon, okay, so here we're all either students or people who work in this domain, but outside this domain and outside students. Universities, to what extent does the Lebanese population know about the importance of, sexual pleasure is something very important and it has rights, and if they don't know, or if they know, to what extent are people going through with campaigns about awareness to this topic, because I think this is a really important topic that most of people need to know about, to at least talk between couple and discuss it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important topic, and actually there are very few campaigns. I remember Marsa tried to publish a campaign on national television a few years ago about a very basic thing, which was using the condom, and it wasn't very well received, and they had to do it on social media, fortunately. So this is a major issue, and unfortunately, as a psychiatrist, I see a lot of people who suffer from the consequences of guilt, the guilt they feel after, discovering they have a certain fetish or a sexual fantasy. I had the opportunity to work with a few people suffering from drug addiction in Nur, and most of them, it was so surprising. Almost 2/3 of the residents there, the initial problem, the core problem, was a sexual fantasy or a fetish that was making them feel so guilty, so alienated from other people, so abnormal, that they started using drugs. And so I agree with you that there is a huge need in education, basic sexual education in schools, and then we can move forward. If we need to work on this, we need to work on different levels, on the community level, on the university students level, but also on the lawmaking level as well. I see a lot of campaigns now about this topic.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms.
Hi, Sara Abusaki. I'm a project coordinator at Marsa. A few years ago, and this is for everyone on the panel, a few years ago we heard of a new pharmaceutical product that they called the pink Viagra, which was basically targeting women with low sexual desire, and correct me if I'm wrong. So there's a lot of controversy when it comes to this pill because, as we know, the Viagra acts on a dysfunction, on a physical dysfunction. So there is actual desire but there's a dysfunction that prevents an individual from acting upon their desire. Whereas for women, it's not actually a physical dysfunction, it's just the lack of desire. And from here also, I would like to point out the fact that we can't actually, or at least your opinion about it, the lack of desire, it's not actually a dysfunction. So I would like to know your input and also how that relates to individuals who identify as asexual, if you have any input, because we didn't actually hear about that.
I will just comment and you can continue. I met one of the experts who worked on flibanserin. And according to these experts, they tell you that it is part of it is biological because it's related to neurotransmitters in the brain. And according to them, there is a lack of neurotransmitters, and the drug is working on the neurotransmitter, it is increasing your, let's say, sensitivity to exciting cues, and it is decreasing your inhibition when you give the drug. Actually, flibanserin, of course, it is not a pink Viagra because it doesn't work on arousal. It's not on demand. It works on desire, and it's a daily intake. But I guess the future drugs that we will have in 2018 and 2019 will be more practical for women to be used. It doesn't mean that sexual desire needs to be there, but some women with acquired, generalized sexual desire hypoactive sexual desire are distressed about it, and they want help about it. And sometimes it can be psychological and neurobiological, and drugs can help. I'll let you continue.
Thanks for this interesting question. I happen to be in the subcommittee that work on this ADI. ADI is commercially called ADI, it's a flibanserin. And there is a very strict indication for the use of this flibanserin after excluding the cause of low desire to be this and this and this and this, which leaves you with a very narrow sector of women complaining of this. But again, now the new thinking is desire is not anymore used in the sense of daily complaints and daily practice and stuff like that. People are talking about interest and arousal, which is much more captured in terms of assessing patients' or women's needs or couples' need and stuff like this. So the issue of interest and arousal. And this has nothing to do with the pleasure, by the way, because one of the perplexion of female desire, in contradistinction to the male desire, is that you feel most desire when you are desired. That's for the female. It's not in male. It's generated from it's generated basically by the evolutionary push of reproduction. Okay, but for female, the more you are desired as a female, irrespective of your sexual preferences, you feel more the desire. And that's why people are talking in terms of now the other track on the issue of interest and arousal. So the pleasure here comes from a different perception. And if you want to talk about body and biology and medical, there is also different circuits that works for the pleasure besides the cultural perception and the other perception of the pleasure for every individual as shaped by the individual or shaped by the society or shaped by other agencies. Yeah, you can.
So I just want to comment on three things. It's on, I guess we're now talking about the hypermedicalization of sexuality and pleasure.
No, nobody's talking about hypermedicalization.
I'm talking about hypermedicalization.
Oh, you want? Yes.
Okay.
Flibanserin has a very limited use, and it has been helpful for that narrow sector of people.
Fair enough, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot of not just necessarily pharmaceutical, but also part of medical patriarchy control over how these advancements get used and how also they're created. I mean, we know that science is not objective completely, and we know that you cannot completely rid science of the other systems that it is brought with, and that's historical on who drugs get tested on who drugs are made to control or not to control, if there is a control issue, of course, or not. So, or who gets to, there's 100,000 contraceptives for women. What is this pathetic excuse of science that cannot create a pill for men at this point? Well, there is one. They've been promising for 100 billion years. But the thing is though, I just want to say on three things. So one on the use of PrEP, actually, there have been groups that have been using PrEP, and actually next week in the talk we're going to have an HIV, somebody who's a PrEP activist in the UK who has been bringing in PrEP. Everybody's been bringing in PrEP and taking PrEP so that they can limit transmission rates, and really it's brought it down to such a low that now the National Health Service, the NHS, is taking it up as a full-on trial, part of the PROUD trial from 2 years back. But that's one, so they did it as people, and now it's kind of expanded and without medical supervision to some extent. And the female pill, if it's a daily daily pill, and it's interesting. I didn't know, Sandrine, that it was continuous. I thought it was a one-time hit. Then that's just embarrassing.
And it's very expensive.
I know it's an antidepressant.
You cannot drink. You have to take it in the evening.
You cannot drive.
It's an antidepressant, and I don't think. And for asexuality, there's nothing wrong with asexuality. So why would it need a fix? No,
it is in cases of acquired.
Oh, no, I know.
Generalized, low desire. It's very specific.
I'm just responding to her comment on asexuality. That if there's nothing wrong with somebody who's asexual, so why fix something that's not broken?
It doesn't work in asexuals anyway.
Yeah.
No.
Doctors.
No, but asexual. No, I forget to comment on this last section. But asexuality and sexual desire, again, there's another. It doesn't mean if you are asexual, then you don't have the sexual desire. Because by definition, and correct me if I'm wrong, but by definition, asexual is people who have a good sexual desire and interest and arousal, but they choose to act or not to act. So asexual doesn't mean they are born not feeling sexual.
No, they're not attracted to people. Asexual are not attracted. They can masturbate, but they're not attracted to people.
But the point is, they have nothing to do with a desire.
But no, that's called abstinence.
Yes,
like people who are abstinent.
But they have a desire.
No.
They have a desire for intimacy, which is a little bit different.
Not sexual.
But not sexual as in
But I think all asexual people are different, the same as all homosexuals are different. Not all homosexuals function the same way, neither do heterosexuals. So asexuality is just, you don't put sex on a pedestal. You may have sex, you may not have sex.
You want to save us from this discussion?
Does somebody have an asexual moment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
You done?
Yes,
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to comment on. Something that was discussed before is the stereotype. Okay, sorry. You talked a lot about sexual.
Can you introduce yourself, if you don't mind?
Sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi. Wudi Hjairi. I'm a student at AUB.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So within. Okay, there's a lot of things I wanted to talk about, but because you brought up asexuality, so we talked about sexual diversity and how like different diverse groups, and it's not just LGBT people, but I also wanted to talk about the fact that sorry, I can't see names. Yasmin? Yamin. Okay, yeah, sorry. What you brought up about even within the homosexuals or asexuals, there's a diverse group of people, and what I wanted to say is that even those sexually diverse people have stereotypes on them. Like when you have homosexuals, for example, homosexual couple, you always have like the top or the bottom, whereas sometimes they might not even enjoy anal sex, and same thing for okay. I'm sorry, the topic of sexuality is something I'm very passionate about, so there's a lot I wanted to talk about. And another thing that was not talked about here, in this discussion is what falls within the definition of sex, because a lot of people focus on the traditional thing that we are taught, which is coitus, a penis goes into vagina and then ejaculation, that's about it. But like people have different experiences in terms of sexuality, and for example, the term foreplay I don't necessarily like, because foreplay in itself is sex, because there's intimacy involved, there's pleasure, there's one or many people involved, and they're happy and they're enjoying themselves, and this actually also falls within this definition of what sex is. And because of that, these stereotypes are also created because within all of these different communities, because I'm not having sex the right way because nothing is being penetrated in an certain orifice, or because that's how everybody should have sex, even though I'm gay or I'm a lesbian or whatever. Something has to go into something else. That's just how things are. And that's what I want to say about that. Another thing, you talked about gender, and thing is, what I don't like is this trend that's happening a lot around the world, that want to just put a clear cut between gender and sexuality, which, they are different things, but to deny the fact that they are interweaving, to deny the fact that you could still be a cis male who is homosexual but still have a bit of femininity in you, to deny all these things and to put so many words to define things, I think also kind of puts a block into what people try, like how people understand these different concepts. And my final thing I wanted to talk about is PrEP. You talked a lot about it, and everything that was raised is obviously correct and everything, but there's one thing that's happening a lot in mostly Western countries who have access to this drug, and mostly within the homosexual men who are sexually active, who are using PrEP. They tend to go into sexual relations and go in, like, having unprotected sex, which is great. I mean, PrEP protects them from HIV, but a lot of them are unaware that some STI, you can still get other STIs, and those who are aware will tell you, but yeah, most of them you could get like cured from, or like you could get a treatment. But I mean, no, not necessarily. You could get a strain of syphilis that's resistant to penicillin. You could get the strain of chlamydia that got released a couple of months ago that's resistant to most antibiotics that exist today.
True.
Because people are engaging in these unsafe practices. And so I wanted to highlight the fact that even though PrEP exists, condoms and safe sexual practices are still something that we need to talk about.
That's why we brought a box of Durex.
Even within this community of people who are aware of these things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we have... yes, please.
Yeah, hi. My name is Zahir Boudahir. I work at AUB. I'm 47. I just would like to mention to the gentleman here that when you really feel not safe doing things, then you can choose the easy way of having a safe long-term partner and so on and so on. That's really the best way. Now, going back to the main question, which is, where were you guys 25, 30 years ago?
Let's please, can you say this again?
Regarding,
No, we heard that one. The one after.
Okay.
The one after.
Where were you guys 25, 30 years ago? Okay. I
was a pre-med.
Because I think one of the best or one of the most important awareness initiatives could be to those people who are targeting to get married and relate all concepts of sexual diversity, awareness, as well as all the rights which we have seen today to vows and culture. And this will really be very helpful in their life, especially that they will be very... they will make use of it instead of waiting a few years or many years and discover that they do not.
That's a good point to consider, Mr. Boudahir. We still have room for other interesting questions, comments. Yes?
Hello. Joseph Sleiman, a research fellow at AU.
Can you give the gentleman you have one. Okay. أقول صوتك قوي كتير. Okay.
So, just a comment on what the gentleman said, and for the atmosphere of what's been talking about. There's a video for TEDx talk in 2012 called 50 Shades of Gay, which sort of goes into the sexual pleasure, and nothing's just 1 and 0, and there's all these shades of whatever sexual orientation you have. 2 questions, one's simple, one's a bit serious, concerning the sexual rights in Lebanon. As we know, mostly it's targeted against violence against women and rape, and the laws to change whatever's already there. So concerning other rights, I would like to know what rights are written in the Lebanese law, if there's any. And another fun question would be, what do you answer when you have the question in the clinic about are aphrodisiacs true or fake, or is there anything you would recommend?
Okay.
Stuff like that.
Any of the panelists would love to answer? I can answer the first one on the rights constitution, but definitely aphrodisiacs.
I can answer.
They have nothing to do with your pleasure or desire or anything. Forget about it. جوز وعسل و
If you believe in it, it works. If you believe in it, it works. I had a patient, he told me,
your brain is the best aphrodisiac.
أكلنا زويتر أحسن من الفياجرا. If he believes in it, it's great, but actually it's not really effective.
It works in 30% of cases, which is the placebo.
Placebo effect. But for the question of rights, I think this is very interesting. In the context of Lebanon, definitely we're not doing very good on rights. There are constitutional rights that you all know about, but sometimes not practiced. But the issue of for example, civil marriage, sexual minorities. I don't like to call them minorities, but the issue of sexual health of the people, sexual preferences of people, the rights of women in marriage, the rights of women outside marriage, the right of to be sexually active or not, to miscarriage and abortion.
Not to get married.
Well, in sexual, not to get married, the sexual rights in Lebanon were not really ahead. If you go back to the Human Declaration in 1948, San Francisco, Lebanon was has the post of the secretary of the committee at that time, chaired by Roosevelt, yes, the widow of the past president of the U.S. So Lebanon was there, but what comes from from the heart of the Human Rights Declaration, the sexual rights, we're really laying behind, because the follow-up of this in the 150 countries in the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of rectification and editorial changes, and so كل بلد صار يعملها على ذوقه more or less. Lebanon من هذا النوع. So ما عندنا أي نوع من rights for the group you mentioned, or even rights for heterosexual.
In Lebanon, you cannot have sex outside of marriage. This is it. We follow le code napoléonien, جايين من الفرنسوية, and they changed it a long time ago, and we didn't change anything in it. So it was more related to some very Catholic.
It's worth mentioning the law that was issued regarding the protection of women from violence and domestic violence. That's the whole issue around marital rape. And now the efforts by NGOs done on the law 505, 518, 522 had to do with the rapist and the survival of the rape to prevent their marriage, and also the impunity for the rapist. كمان these are in the under 18 marriage also, a whole issue that are promising in the making.
I also think that there's a problem with thinking about sexual rights. Sexual rights don't come out of a vacuum. Sexual rights come from the respect of people who are living in that land, who want to live a life that is of their choice. So if we know that women cannot pass their nationality, their citizenship, that's I find it hard to believe that cohabitation and being mothers who are unmarried is something that's going to happen anytime soon, which really will eventually trickle to queer couples as well. Everybody's kind of locked in with each other, so there are many other laws that obviously are violating women's issues and trans bodies' issues and queer people's issues, so much that on a different levels, not necessarily about sexual, that make it hard for people to move around the city, that make it hard to get a job, that make it hard to live. So for me, we can't have sexual rights without any of all of these things as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's also the bigger umbrella. Other questions or yes, please. This will be the last question, and then you're gonna leave on the door to my left for your for cocktail, and also for our interactions and more. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. First of all, my name is Evelina Rossi. I have been working for the organization Planned Parenthood in the U.S. I don't know if anyone here would have heard of it, but it's always in the news in America.
Yes, I know them.
Yeah. And so I just kind of wanted to bring it back to basics about the title of this conference. We have been talking about sexual health as a facilitator or a gateway to sexual pleasure. And I was wondering what your experiences are, your thoughts are on sort of the inverse. So how does sexual pleasure endanger or complicate sexual health? So for example, non-consensual sex, unprotected sex, sex as a weapon.
Interesting.
Any of the panelists? This was tackled a little bit by Rula.
Yeah, I think that's something that we were discussing. I think if we had more time, we could the details of it, but I think definitely the issue of consent, I mean, that's not even seen. I don't even consider that sexual pleasure. If it was rape, then that's a violent crime. If somebody enjoys shooting somebody in the head, I don't call that, I wouldn't see the link to that, but definitely I think that there needs to be a conversation about all of these kinds of crimes and how they affect the attainment of sexual pleasure. Can I use this as a moment to say that we have a sexuality hotline, by the way? Sorry, forgot. Where we can discuss sexual pleasure between 5 and 11 p.m. 7668062.
We have a 24/7 hotline.
I think the panelists should stick to the topic of the.
Sorry. No, but the thing is that with regarding that, because a lot of people do actually call and discuss how sexual violence has affected how they continue to seek out sexual pleasure, or if they even want to. And the truth is that we kind of go around saying the same thing that maybe Sandrine has said, which is you don't push yourself into anything that you don't want to do, and that consent and basically your bodily autonomy and your bodily integrity and agency is the most important of things. And I really like what the person up had said about foreplay, that we say foreplay as a beginning to something, like we're expecting that there is more to come, but that really, I think, there's play and you decide how far that goes, and that's your own decision. And so this is a conversation that we've had often.
But he also talked about the construct of pleasure and the stereotype of pleasure, and this is what I appreciated the most about his intervention. I think we should conclude with this, honestly, because this is really, really important. The notion of pleasure is also a stereotype, because couples or throuples or groups, they can decide what is pleasure for them.
Well, with this interesting note, definitely I cannot conclude, because concluding something is also stereotyping the conclusion. So the whole point is sexual pleasure is and should be a vital part of sexual rights and of human rights. And definitely it is a reflection of how progressive we are on the issue of rights and of freedom. And definitely it's up to everyone to understand, to perceive, to practice the pleasure in the way that will ultimately satisfy their sexual life and sexual well-being. Thank you very much, and please join us for the refreshment. Thank you very much.